Well, good day, everyone. This time around, I would like to introduce the topic of new historicist approach. This is the approach that we're going to be using for the rest of the semester. It may be used to analyze any type of literature, but it is particularly helpful in dealing with literature that is produced by a cultural group. So I think it's going to be pretty helpful. Actually, new historicism belongs to a larger discipline called cultural poetics that studies anything that is produced in culture, um, besides literature and language, also art and music and food, just behaviors, religion, anything that is produced in culture may be analyzed and may be used to try and understand the origins of that culture and that society. That's what cultural poetics does. And there's also a multiplicity that is inherent in every cultural situation. This is a very important tenet of cultural poetics because it tells us that there's no homogeneity in cultural context. There's also variety. There's always diversity, and that's important to keep in mind. So cultural poetics studies cultural products as a source of information. Every culture then is a mixture of worldviews, mentalities, and positions. In our society, or in any society, we have subgroups, subcultures. So here in Costa Rica, for example, we have people from different religions, from different backgrounds, people from the countryside, from the city. Politically, we are also very diverse, racially diverse. And that makes us one culture and one society, but at the same time, a group of subcultures and subgroups within society. And that's what it makes it rich and relevant for analysis. Giving our culture as an example, but this is the same thing for any culture around the world. Now, another important tenet is that there's always a dominant group that uses this diversity to strengthen its own position and propagate power. Here again, we hear the concept of power that we've been studying, because there are subgroups within one society. There's always going to be one group that is more powerful than the others, and this diversity actually works for the benefit of those who are in a position of power because they position themselves with regards to all the other subgroups that do not have the same power, whether because it's the religious, racial, gender situation that makes them more vulnerable, or socioeconomic situation that makes them more vulnerable. So there are always groups in power that would assume control. Some important assumptions for new historicism are the following. There is no such thing as complete objectivity. We start acknowledging the fact that there's no complete objectivity. That means that there's always the worldviews and the opinions about the world are no more than that, opinions. So every subject, every person has a subjective point of view about reality. And we assume that and we understand it when we read literature and we analyze it, right? There's no objectivity. Also, that each culture, that is cultural product, must be examined in terms of its cultural context. We analyze the literary text in terms of the context in which it was produced. Every society is made up of different subgroups, like I already explained, which interact in unequal, and this is a key word, unequal positions of power. Not all the subgroups have the same position and the same amount of power. Context is both fragmented and dynamic. That is, any cultural and social context is made up of different parts that are divided among themselves, but that relate to each other dynamically. So in one society, we have different subgroups and cultural subgroups that are separated from each other, but at the same time enter into communication with each other. So in a large city, for example, we would have the people who are economically and socially more powerful that for one reason or the other have to enter into contact with other groups in society. There are racial groups, there are minorities, there are gender groups, there are submitted to the power of the authorities, and they interact constantly. So context is fragmented and dynamic. There is no single truth or reality. I think this emphasizes again the idea that there's no complete objectivity. I'm sorry. There's no complete objectivity because there's no one single truth or reality. And these are some of the objectives of New Historicism. What do we do when we analyze a literary text from the New Historicist point of view? We examine the literary text as a culture product. So we see the text first and foremost as a product of culture. We identify in it and reveal the variety of behavioral codes manifested in the text. And this is another very important term, behavioral codes. What are the codes? What are the patterns that are followed by the members of this culture in order to behave? And we see that in literature. What are the traditions? What are their values? What are their worldviews? What makes them behave the way they do? How do they behave? How do women behave? How do men behave? How are children supposed to behave? So all of those dynamics of behavior are relevant to us when we read the literary text. So we analyze every character and groups of character in terms of how they behave within their context. Also, we look for the main issues at stake. We look for problems, areas of struggle in the text. Who is having a conflict with whom? And an account of what? Is it because they belong to different races or different genders? Or is it because they belong to different social classes? What are the struggles and why are they taking place? Also, we examined how different groups represented in the text relate to each other, because as we said, there are dynamic in their relationship. How do they relate to each other, the different subgroups in society? Some key terms that I will try and define are the following. Trans-individual subject. This is key. What this means is that every subject, in the case of literature, every character or even a narrator or a speaker in a poem, every subject represents a whole group, a social and cultural group or subgroup within society. So characters are not just themselves. They stand for whole cultural groups. This is a trans-individual subject. It goes beyond the individual to represent a group of people. So keep that in mind as you find characters in the texts that we'll be reading, because these characters represent social groups and cultural groups. Hegemony is a very important term. It's related to power, of course. Some of the groups and subgroups that we find within society are hegemonic. They exert power over the other groups. Ideology, it has to do with the concept of discourse that we already discussed at the beginning of the semester. Discourse meaning language, ideology put into language. So ideology in terms of what are the ideas behind this literary text and behind this culture? What are their thoughts? How do they see the world? What is right? What is wrong? What is valuable? What is not? And we find that also in discourse, the language and how it is used. Is the language used to communicate a certain view of the world that is, whether it's right or wrong, that doesn't really matter, but we try and find what is the ideology behind these characters and what they do, and how is it represented in the language of the literary text that we're reading. Subject, I already explained, is an individual that represents a whole group, maybe a character, the narrator, the speaker. We as readers are also subjects because we react subjectively to the text, but many of these subjects are subjected. That means they are in position, in a disadvantageous position, right? They are in a position in which the power is exerted over them. They are subjected to power, to rules, to hegemony. Agency would be pretty much the opposite. Agency is the capacity to act individually and autonomously. Not every character and not every social group or cultural group within a society has the same amount of agency. And that is the power to act, to make decisions, to change their reality. Some groups in society have that power, others don't. Subject position is the situation of a character, and we can describe it in terms of how much power they have, how they relate to other subject positions, how they take part within a social group. So a subject position is like a description of what is the situation of the character as a subject, okay? And we give all those characteristics, and then we're describing the subject position in the context of where it belongs. And the concepts of acquiescence and subversion, which are opposite. I think we've already mentioned these in class briefly. Acquiescence means accepting reality as it is without fighting back. And subversion is the opposite. Subversion means fighting back, right? Not accepting the situation or the subject position, not accepting it, but trying to rebel against it using language, using acts of violence, or whatever form is available. That's subversion. Okay, so this is the source where this information comes from. And actually in Aula Virtual, you'll find a 2-page summary of this information and a definition of these key terms that I mentioned here, some analysis questions that we're going to be using in class, the most important assumptions and the objectives that I described here. You'll find that in that document, and it's going to prove very, very useful for you, hopefully. Okay, so see you next class. Bye-bye.